Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 236, Cortés. Last week, we walked right up to the introduction of Hernan Cortes. The governor of Cuba, Juan Velasquez, is certain that his explorers have found something of significance to the west. What that might be, he's not so sure. But Velasquez is a man of ambition, and not an insignificant amount of greed. He wants what's over there, whatever that might be. His hope, of course, is that it is gold, but silver will do just as well in a pinch. This time, he's not going to use his nephew, however. He'll have to find someone new, and as we're about to see, the man he picks will be, depending on your point of view, either the perfect or absolute worst man for the job. Velasquez wanted someone to lead the new venture who would have more imagination, a bit more gusto than Grijalva. He also wanted someone who'd be able to finance the expedition on their own. But he didn't want to make a great armada of conquest. More than anything else, this was to be a holding operation to prevent some other Spaniard from horning in on his terrain. It was going to be hard to find the right person to lead it. And at least from Velasquez's point of view, in the end, he made a mistake. In the end, he picked a man who had been his protege for 10 years. A young man who had been his nephew in all but name. Hernan Cortes. We think Cortes was born in 1484. Certainly, he came to the New World in 1506, and would have been in his 30s at the time. Hernan Cortes was descended from some of the most turbulent families in one of the wildest parts of Castile. It certainly rubbed off on him. Several people did testify in 1525, when Hernan Cortes was making a petition in Valladolid to become a knight, that his parents were minor nobles. Thus, he had a right to a coat of arms. How much of that was true, we're not sure. Cortes's history has always been shrouded in mystery. His first biographer, a Sicilian humanist, claimed he was Italian. Again, without evidence. He wasn't. Italian, that is. The fact is, Cortes's meteoric rise to fame meant that a lot of people wanted to claim him as their own. Sadly, these efforts were often without basis. Where Cortes learned about soldiering, we are not sure, though his father seems to have been in the military and gained some renown as a fighter. At some point, Cortes becomes an excellent horseman, though again, when that happened, we're not sure. And although there's little record of Cortes's childhood, he must have become literate at some point relatively early in life. We know that Cortes left Castile in his middle teens. In 1496, he went to Salamanca, a significant city in northwestern Spain. His stint in Salamanca was short-lived, however. By 1501, Cortes was back in his hometown of Medellin. His parents seemed to have been angry about his return. They hoped he had remained there and become a lawyer. Cortes did not want to become a lawyer. He was determined on a life of action. But he seemed to have vacillated for a while, between going to the Indies or going to fight in the interminable Spanish wars in Italy. This is, of course, the period within which the French and Spanish are fighting for dominance over Milan, etc., etc. For reasons that Cortes never seems to have dwelt on, but which certainly had something to do with family connections, he eventually decided to go to the Indies. Cortes set off for Seville, where another adventurer, Ovando, the man who was intended to replace Columbus, was making his plans for his expedition of 32 ships. This was intended to rejuvenate Hispaniola after its depredation by the Genoese, again, a reference to Columbus. Seville, with about 40,000 inhabitants, was then actually the largest city in Spain. It was the capital of the Spanish maritime enterprise, a, quote, veritable Babylon, end quote. Italian sailors, German printers, slaves from Guinea brought there by Portuguese merchants, and descendants of earlier waves of African slaves and long-banished Moors, all crowded into the city. Long-established Genoese merchants had infected the aristocracy with a zeal for enterprise. This contrasted with the backward and parochial rivalries of towns such as the one that Hernan Cortes came from, Medellin. At the time, Seville was home to a new, still unfinished cathedral, which was going to be the biggest in Christendom. It was the best port in Spain. Abundant water was brought in by old Roman aqueducts. The public baths of Seville must have seemed astonishing to someone like Cortés. Those in Seville were proud of their soaps, their olive oils, their oranges. Cortés probably would have been impressed with all of this as much as he would be seeing the new world for himself, because frankly, Seville, compared to Medellin, was a new world. Cortés would have seen the great palaces of the dukes. Perhaps he witnessed marching drills outside the walls. In fact, the king and queen themselves were in Seville in 1502. While in spring, there was a forced expulsion of the resident Moors. But Cortés didn't leave with Ovando, the future governor of Hispaniola. Waiting for his ship, he managed to fall out of a window, injuring himself. It seems he was trying to see a certain young lady surreptitiously, and the meeting went awry. While recovering from his fall, Cortés fell ill with malaria and missed his ships. He might have been lucky. Hispaniola was even less healthy than Spain at the time. Around 2,500 men set sail with Ovando. 1,000 of these died of some kind of sickness within a month of arrival, while another 500 fell seriously ill. With no other great expedition to the Indies planned, Cortés again considered going to Italy. He set off for Valencia, from where he might plan to take a ship to Naples. Had he gone, he might have participated in one of the many great Spanish victories in that theater taking place at the time. But once again, it seems that Cortés hesitated. The Indies was where his destiny waited, and the Indies is where he would go. We do not know exactly what Cortés was up to for the next 2 years, because it would not be until 1506 that he finally set sail for the New World. Most historians believe he spent his time in Valladolid and Salamanca. There he might have studied law. We know he was a notary by the time he left. Regardless, he used his time well, observing the world and broadening his understanding of the Renaissance. In terms of worldview, of course, Cortés, like so many men of this era, have remained the subject of some controversy. Historians have disputed as to whether the Middle Ages or the Renaissance dominated Cortés's approach to his self-appointed tasks in the Indies. Certainly the values of first seen through the lenses of ballads and make it look like Cortés was decidedly medieval. Like most of the conquistadors of his generation, he would see the Indians of the Caribbean as if they were just new Moors, to be converted, conquered, and subjected. But Cortés's experience at Salamanca and Valladolid seems to have given his purpose more of a Renaissance edge than we would have noticed. Although he might not have ever heard of him, he would have agreed with the great writer Alberti. In The Family, argued that the end of education was to create a man who prizes, quote, the beauty of honor, the delights of fame, and the divineness of glory, end quote. He was a man of two worlds, like so many, and that's a theme that I'm going to come back to again and again throughout this story, about how Cortés is in many ways the sort of bridge conquistador between the early modern period and the late medieval period. And the contradictions between those two worlds, seen in one man, are fascinating in how they play out in the story. In the summer of 1506, Cortés was in Seville, working in a notary's office. From there, he traveled to the famous port of Guadalajara, where he would depart for the New World. From there, he paid 11 gold ducats to a local merchant in exchange for a passage to Hispaniola. Cortés left us no count of his voyage to the West Indies. But that journey could hardly have been any different from what transpired when a Dominican friar crossed the Atlantic 40 years later. He left us the following quote: "The ship is very strong, a narrow prison from which no one can flee, even though there are no chains. The heat, stuffiness, and sense of confinement are sometimes overpowering. The bed is ordinarily the floor. Add to this the general nausea and poor health. Most passengers go about as if out of their minds and in great torment. There is a terrible smell, especially below deck, which becomes intolerable throughout the ship when the pump is functioning, and it is doing that 4 to 5 times a day. The dirt is appalling. The only lavatory slung over the side, dangerous. The only meat, bacon. The thirst of everyone is overpowering." End quote. To pass the time, men played dice, cards, bet on cockfights, though there were the usual plays, dances, singing, reading aloud, and observation of the stars. And of course, all the men talked about the riches that awaited them in the New World. Cortés did later recall that one man told him in order to find gold, one needed to be prepared to work hard and get lucky. And from the moment that he was there, Cortés was fortunate in one regard. Governor Ovando favored him. Cortés, from the moment that he reached Hispaniola, would never again live in one place so long as he lived. Even early on, he gained a reputation as a gallant Latin-speaking lawyer. He got in more physical than legal fights, however, one of which resulted in a scar on his chin. Cortés was certainly restless. Very shortly after arriving in Hispaniola, he was trying to get out. Cortés was smart enough to notice that everyone who stayed in Hispaniola seemed to, die, especially of some tropical disease, sooner or later. He tried to join in on Diego Nueces' voyage off the island, but he injured his right leg and had to stay. It proved to be providential. Nueces' voyage ended in shipwreck. He did get off the island, though. Cortés traveled to Cuba, where he became the first European to be a notary and the first European to own cattle. He even found some gold in 1512, though not much. Life was good to Cortés on Cuba. He built a hacienda, accumulated some wealth, and had a daughter by an Indian girl. Governor Velázquez stood as his godfather. But it was not long before he and his benefactor, Governor Velázquez, had a series of falling outs. Cortés was one of a group of colonists who wanted the Spanish to be more aggressive in their use of the encomienda system. This system was little more than chattel slavery, where local Indians were forced into performing labor for their European landlords. In essence, what Cortés wanted in this rebellion was more native servants. Velázquez said no. So Cortés and several other landlords rose in a quasi-rebellion. It did not end well for him. Velázquez easily crushed the revolt and was prepared to send Cortés to Santo Domingo under arrest. In the end, he changed his mind. Cortés was eventually reconciled with Velázquez, and Las Casas described him at the time as, quote, downcast and humble, hoping for a smile from the least important of Velázquez's servants, end quote. Cortés next appears in the records, accompanying Velázquez on a small expedition to put down some quote-unquote rebels in western Cuba. It seems that no matter what Cortés did, Velázquez always forgave him. We do have to remember that, as the governor, Velázquez needed good men around him, and there just weren't very many of those. Many of the skilled men who made the voyage to the New World had this nasty habit of, well, dying. Hernan Cortes in 1518 was known to be resourceful, capable, and good with words in both speech and writing. He talked well, always having the right expression for the occasion, and was very agreeable in conversation. And in this way, he was already experienced in politics. He had that capacity of all successful men, of being able to conceal their real intentions. Las Casas described him as prudent, and crucially in the sources, he's reported as never losing his temper. Interestingly, at least as early as 1516, if Cortés had one weakness, it was as a military planner. This might seem odd, as the man known probably as the greatest of all conquistadors, but by that year, Cortés had only seen live action in 2 small battles in the Caribbean. He was hardly the man anyone would expect to conquer Mexico. But Velázquez reports how Cortés, even though these are minor skirmishes, was very cool, was very calm during each of these engagements. Did he have that in mind when he tapped Cortés as the man who would lead the next expedition west? Probably not. In reality, he probably hoped Cortés wouldn't have to fight anyone. But if that's what he hoped, he was wrong. Cortés, so we know, was literate, though even if he wasn't a great warrior. Whether or not he attended some university courses while at Valladolid, Cortés was certainly capable of passing for a well-read man. If Velázquez was expecting a bookworm, however, one who would do as he was told, in Cortés, he was gravely mistaken. We don't know much about what Cortés looked like. He was short, about 5 feet 4 inches. Cortés's first biographer in 1530 wrote that his hair was rather red, but another man who saw Cortés just about every day for 2 years wrote that his beard was, quote, dark, and his hair the same as his beard, end quote. Probably the truth is that his hair was brown with some reddish tint. Governor Velázquez told Cortés that Grijalva's expedition had been a failure. He was wrong in jumping the gun at that point, but at the moment that he says that, Grijalva hadn't returned, so his assessment may have been fair, given the rate at which expeditions were either shipwrecked or just didn't return for any reason. So Velázquez asked Cortés to go west and follow up on Grijalva's expedition, because it seemed like he was in some difficulty. Velázquez would provide Cortés with 2 or 3 ships. Cortés would need to find the money for any other vessels, and for all the supplies, for that matter. Velázquez gave Cortés a set of very detailed orders, dated October the 3rd, 1518. The orders were drafted by one Andrés de Duero, but later amended and corrected by Cortés himself. The orders later inspired significant controversy. Velázquez, for his part, would later claim that Cortés simply ignored his orders. The orders were a long, and in some ways contradictory document. A preamble rehearsed the background to Grijalva's expedition. This section spoke of the need to, quote, populate and discover, unquote, new territories. That really was a license to colonize, and something that, as we're going to see, Cortés is going to seize on in a big way. But the instruction itself, as opposed to the preamble, envisaged a journey of discovery and modest trading. The instruction proper said that the principal purpose of the expedition was to serve God. Blasphemy and sleeping with native women were, therefore, not allowed. And if we're going down the list of other things that are not allowed, the playing of cards were banned, Cuban Indians were not allowed to accompany the expedition. The fleet was to keep together and travel west along the coast as much as Grijalva was known to have done. Any Indians encountered had to be well treated. The natives of Cozumel were to be told of the power of the King of Spain and how he had placed the islands of the Caribbean under his control. They were to hear the famous requerimiento, or a version of it, placing them also under the rule of Charles V in return for protection. Everywhere that Cortés landed, he was told to take possession of the place in the name of the Crown of Castile, doing so in the most solemn way possible. A notary was, of course, to be present for these occasions. The assumption was that Cortés would keep touching at islands. The idea that there was this vast continent populated by an advanced empire is not something anyone thought about at this stage. He was also ordered to seek news of any Christians allegedly being held captive in the Yucatan. As you can tell, as always, there needed to be some kind of religious component to any voyage of discovery. In addition to a notary, a royal treasurer and inspector were to be appointed to collect and catalog any gold, pearls, and precious stones that might be exchanged with the natives. On no account was anyone ever to sleep on shore. Cortés was to report about the local flora and fauna he encountered and, obviously, search for gold. There were some, what we might call, hopelessly romantic orders as well. Cortés was, amongst other things, supposed to locate and make contact with the famous lost tribe of the Amazons. There was, as in most such instructions, a clause which gave Cortés such powers as he might need to carry out instructions not specifically covered by earlier paragraphs. Another paragraph gave him legal authority to act as judge in any criminal case which might arise. Probably neither party to the document was willing to show their real feelings when they signed it. Velázquez thought the expedition would be nothing more than a holding operation. Cortés had, let's just say, bigger plans. Like most such papers, it was a contract, giving state authority for a private venture. The Crown gave approval subject to certain conditions. Everything else was just kind of dependent on what happened. This massive document was handed to Cortés at a little ceremony in Santiago, Cuba. Having received his orders, Cortés immediately began looking for men and ships. He purchased existing ships, not thinking he had time to have any built. By and large, he bought on credit. Cortés hoped to finance the entire enterprise after the fact. Obviously, this was a huge risk for the creditors, which is why they charged massive interest rates on these kind of loans. It was definitely a boom or a bust kind of business. Almost immediately, the scale of Cortés's operations started to worry Velázquez. There seemed to be no relation between the instructions he was given and the massive amount of resources that he was spending. Cortés, in Velázquez's words, seemed to be, quote, doing what he liked, end quote. He began to live as if he were a king. His whole attitude changed. He even dressed differently, as befitted, he thought, a leader of men, with a famous hat full of a plume of feathers, a medallion of gold, a black velvet cloak with golden knots. Velázquez had begun by going down every day to the port in Santiago to see how the preparations were going. But once he became worried, he more or less kept away. I think his plan was to distance himself from the expedition once, in his opinion, it went horribly wrong. Only about 3 weeks after getting his orders, Cortés had 3 ships and 300 men ready to go. Around mid-November, it appears Velázquez began having second thoughts about Cortés. But this only made Cortés hasten even more. Had Velázquez wanted to replace Cortés immediately, he could have done it. He was essentially all-powerful on the island. Cortés's larger concern, though, was that Velázquez might soon be confirmed as the governor of the Yucatan in addition to Cuba. This would have made him technically the governor of Mexico as well. It would have really complicated things for Cortés. Cortés would lose any rights of conquest if the territory he went into already had a Spanish governor. He wanted to make his fortune, not make things better for Velázquez. He was only willing to do the latter as a means to the former. Velázquez eventually made up his mind to relieve Cortés of his commission, but he didn't want to face the man himself. Instead, he told a subordinate to go to Cortés and say that he, the governor, would reimburse him for what he had spent if he would cease his preparations. He also tried to prevent Cortés from buying any more food. This was easy for Velázquez because he controlled the biggest seller of wines, oil, vinegar, and even clothes in Cuba. Cortés just chose to ignore all this. When the guy came to tell him that, he'll reimburse you, but you're done, Cortés just smiled, nodded, and kept getting ready. When no one would sell him any food, he just kept working. Finally, at last, Velázquez built up enough nerve to cancel Cortés's orders and transfer the authority which he had given him to another man, Luis de Medina. But Cortés's brother-in-law, Juan Suarez, managed to waylay the messenger on a lonely road, murder him, and toss the body into a ravine. Then he took the papers of appointment intended for Luis de Medina and gave them to Cortés, only strengthening his course of action. Eventually, Cortés decided that the best case scenario was for him to get out of Cuba as soon as possible. Immediately, he called the local accountant. He told him that he wanted to leave immediately with the ships which were ready. He wanted him to register those vessels there and then. How he did so, and the man did, even though he was loyal to Velázquez, and how he did that we really don't know. Regardless, Cortés went on board his flagship. He left his Indian wife, his mines, and his house without much concern. His only interest now was his expedition. The next day, the governor rose from his bed at daybreak and went out to the docks. Cortés, flanked by armed men, had a conversation with him from a small boat. Velázquez said, quote, "How is it, my friend, that you're setting off in this way? Is this a good way to say goodbye to me?" Cortés replied, "Forgive me, but these things have all been thought about some time before they were ordered. What are now your orders?" Velázquez was shaken by the insubordination, but did not make a reply. Cortés instructed his captains to set off. It was the 18th of November, 1518. If you've enjoyed the episode, check out the website, westerncivpodcast.com. It's got tons of additional resources, bonus episodes, all kinds of things like that. If you are interested in having the show without any advertisements, that's available for $1 a month. Follow the link in the show notes, patreon.com/Western Civ Podcast. And if you enjoy the concept of Western Civ, check out Western Civ 2.0. I have a link in the podcast for a free 7-day trial. Western Civ 2.0 follows the same course of history as this free feed, but with much greater depth and, at least for the additional episodes, much better audio quality. Finally, I do know that I have some teachers who listen, as I am also a teacher. If you are interested in teaching resources, I have a link in the show notes to those resources as well that cover all kinds of different time periods.